Silvio Dante is the most quotable man in this show and the hardest one to look at straight. He gets the aphorisms. You're only as good as your last envelope, the bit about which two businesses never go out of style. And he delivers them in a suit that costs more than most people's rent, under a pompadour you could land a plane on. He is also, in the plainest available English, a guy who makes his living renting women out by the hour. The room is a windowless box off Route 17 in Lodi. Purple light, a bar, a stage, a back office where Tony keeps his desk. It is the least glamorous building on television and the most consequential one in New Jersey, because an absurd number of decisions that matter in this show get made inside it, 6 feet from a woman on a pole, and Silvio holds the keys. Fans have a shorthand for what he is: glorified pimp. It gets deployed as a takedown, usually by someone tired of hearing Sil quoted like scripture, and the implication is that all that consigliere gravitas is a costume over something much smaller and much dirtier. My read is that the insult is half right and lands on the wrong word. Pimp is accurate. It's glorified that's doing the lying, because it implies there's a legitimate version of Silvio underneath the strip club, some real gangster the Bing is a front for. There isn't. The Bing isn't the front, the Bing is the business. Everything else the DiMeo family does. Keep circling back to a room, Silvio keeps warm. Look at how those scenes are built. So many major decisions on this show get made at the Bing, and so many of them are staged the same way. 2 or 3 men in the foreground, faces lit, talking about money or murder, and behind their heads, soft and slightly out of focus, a woman moving. She has no name, she has no dialogue. The camera doesn't care about her, and neither do the men, which is precisely why she's there. She's set dressing for their sense of themselves. The show puts a naked body 6 feet behind a conversation about loyalty and honor and lets you decide how you feel about that. Chase rarely underlines it. It's just the wallpaper of the world, week after week, for 6 seasons, and Silvio is the guy who hangs the wallpaper. That's his job, not the consigliere thing. The actual, daily, punch-a-clock labor of his life is arranging those bodies, booking them, paying them, disciplining them, replacing them. He's involved in loan sharking and bookmaking too, sure, but the Bing is the center of his working life, and the show is very clear about how much happens there beyond dancing. The dancing is the polite version. Silvio's business is making money from access to women, and everything else, the suits, the Sun Tzu, the council, sits on top of that. He knows it too, which is the part that makes him so much more interesting than the takedown allows. In For All Debts, Public and Private, Tony is chewing out the crew for weak earnings during the recession, and he turns to Sil to deliver the company line. What 2 businesses have been recession-proof since time immemorial? And Silvio, without a beat, gives him certain aspects of show business and our thing. Certain aspects. He's not a stupid man, he knows which aspects. The phrasing is a tiny bit of embroidery, an eighth of an inch of distance between himself and what he sells, and that eighth of an inch is where Silvio Dante lives. Because here is the fact that reframes him completely once you know it. Silvio wanted to be a singer. Not a gangster, a performer. The singing career didn't work out, and what survived was the show business part of him. Only now he owns the room instead of standing on the stage. And look at what that version of show business became. Young women perform, Silvio runs the room, the house takes its cut. He gets to stay close to entertainment without ever having to be the person people came to see. I find that genuinely sad, and I want to be careful about it, because sadness is not a defense. Half the guys on this show are running some version of the same con on themselves. Tony wants to be Gary Cooper, Paulie wants to be a legend, Christopher wants to be Scorsese, Ralph wants to be Maximus, and he says so out loud while swinging a chain at a man's face. The show is a coral reef of thwarted men performing the movie version of a life they're too small for, and Silvio's performance is the most literal because he does an actual impression. You know the one. Season 2, Pussy comes back from Puerto Rico, or wherever the hell he claims he's been. Everyone's happy, and nobody quite believes it, and Pussy says he's been gone a long time. Let me hear it. And Sil does Pacino. Just when I thought I was out, they pull me back in. The room laughs. He does it again over the years, at parties, for the guys, a bar trick. 2 things about that bit. First, it's a quote from The Godfather Part 3, which everyone agrees is the weakest of them, and Silvio's whole aesthetic is built on the good parts of a trilogy he's cheerfully quoting from the bad part of. He's a fan, he's us. He's the guy in the comments who knows all the lines. Second, and this is the one that stays with me, he's playing a man who is trying to get out and can't. That's the joke, that's why it kills at parties. But Silvio never seriously tries to get out. He doesn't have a Melfi, he doesn't have a panic attack in a driveway over ducks. He has no real exit fantasy. Plenty of people around him do. Tony has therapy, Chris has the screenplay, Vito has New Hampshire. Adriana has the drive west that turns out to be a daydream in the passenger seat. Silvio has an impression of a man who wants out, performed by a man who seems perfectly content to remain exactly where he is, in the middle of a room he built to keep everybody in. A failed singer who runs a strip club, doing impressions of movie gangsters for men who are the real thing. There's a symmetry there that's almost too neat, and I'd distrust it if the show weren't so patient about it. The bit never gets a wink, never gets pointed at. It just keeps being what he does at parties. Anyway, the impressions and the suits and the recession-proof line are all pleasant enough until university, and then the show stops letting you enjoy him. Season 3, Episode 6, the one everybody has a hard time rewatching. Tracee is 20, she's a dancer at the Bing, she's pregnant by Ralph Cifaretto, and by the end of the hour, Ralph has beaten her to death against a guardrail in the parking lot. That's the crime everyone remembers, and it's the crime that redefines Ralph permanently. Up until then, he's an obnoxious asshole. After this, he's something else entirely. Fine. But Ralph is not the only person the episode is quietly indicting. Follow the money. Tracee owes Silvio. He fronted her the cash for her braces. There is a tempting reading there that fixing her teeth is basically a capital improvement. Better smile, better product. The show never has Sil say that outright, so I don't want to pretend it does. What it does make explicit is uglier enough. He paid for the braces. She owes him money. He is making money on that debt, and the debt gives him leverage over when she works and whether she gets to leave. Earlier in the episode, Tracee brings Tony some date nut bread she baked for him. Silvio sees her standing around, taps his watch, calls her Betty Crocker, and sends her back to work. At first, it almost plays like a joke, the boss catching an employee wasting time. Then she misses 3 days. She's holed up at Ralph's, and Silvio drives over there personally to collect. Not a soldier, not a bouncer. The consigliere of the DiMeo crime family gets in his car and drives to a townhouse to retrieve a stripper. He gets her outside, and he slaps her around in the driveway, while Ralph watches from an upstairs window, laughing, knowing she's pregnant with his kid. And Silvio tells her, in language I'm not going to fully reproduce, that until she pays what she owes, her body belongs to him. Not her time, not her labour, her body. He says the quiet part in the plainest possible English, in a driveway in daylight, and suddenly that earlier tap on the watch means something different. That gesture is the whole man. He points at his wrist and calls her Betty Crocker because from his perspective, this is scheduling. That's what makes the later scene so ugly. A woman can be slapped around in a driveway and sent back to work because the violence and the shift are part of the same system. Later, she'll mouth off to Ralph in front of the crew, and the guys will laugh at him, and his humiliation will follow her into the parking lot and end her. I've seen people argue that Silvio doesn't bear real weight for Tracee's death because he didn't swing the fatal blow, and technically that's true, and I still think it's an evasion. Ralph killed her. Silvio helped build the conditions in which she was being used, controlled and indebted before Ralph ever took her outside. And afterward, Silvio explains why none of it changes the rules. 2 episodes later, in He Is Risen, Tony is still eating himself alive over having hit a made guy, and Sil sits across from him and lays out the actual ledger. He acknowledges it was a tragedy. He says he hears him. And then he explains why Tony was wrong. She wasn't related to him by blood or marriage. She wasn't his Gumar. Ralphie's a made guy. It's delivered as consolation. It's meant kindly. It is also, line by line, the most complete statement of this organization's moral accounting that anyone gives in the entire series. A woman's life registers through the relationships the organization recognizes. Wife, daughter, mistress, those are categories that generate obligation. Tracee had none of them in relation to Tony. Inside their system, she had almost no protected status at all. She was inventory, and inventory getting broken is a business problem before it is a moral one. And Tony, who beat a man over this girl, takes the note. He doesn't really argue with the rule. He absorbs it and moves on, and Ralph rises anyway because Ralph earns. Silvio's arithmetic wins, as it usually does. Taking a step back for a second, because there's a version of this essay that just piles up the ugly and calls it analysis, and I don't think that's honest to what the show's doing. The strongest counter-argument to the title of this video isn't that Silvio is better than a pimp. It's that pimp is too small a word, and using it lets everyone else off the hook. Because if the Bing is a pimping operation with a consigliere attached, then Tony isn't a tragic suburban dad with a duck problem. He's a guy whose office is in the back of a strip club. Paulie isn't just a comic relief legend, he's a customer. Christopher isn't only a doomed artist, he's also a guy deeply embedded in the same world that produces places like the Crazy Horse. The reason glorified pimp feels like it's aimed at Silvio specifically is that he's the one holding the clipboard. Everyone else gets to be a gangster because Silvio agreed to be the manager. Chase understood this. The Bada Bing does for this show what the diner did for Seinfeld. It's the hangout, the couch, the place you cut back to. Except the couch is in a strip club, and the show made that choice in the pilot and never apologized for it or made it dramatic. It just kept being true in the background of hundreds of conversations. The most domestic space in the series, the place where these men are most relaxed and most themselves, is a room where women's bodies are part of the transaction. That's not incidental to the portrait. It might be the whole portrait. Which brings up something I keep chewing on. Silvio is arguably one of the least self-deceived men in the show. Tony spends 7 years in therapy constructing a version of himself that can be lived with. Carmela has the church and the spec house. Chris has the recovery language and the screenplay. Silvio has very little of that. He doesn't claim to be a good man. He doesn't get a redemption beat, doesn't have an extended crisis of conscience on screen, doesn't need a therapist to explain the contradiction to him. He simply does the work, and when someone challenges the work, he explains the economics. His daughter challenges it, or at least that's how Silvio tells the story. Heather, the principessa, the kid he clearly adores, has apparently gone on what he dismisses as a feminist rant about the Bing being demeaning to women. Silvio repeats the argument to the guys, half amused and half genuinely puzzled. The fact that these girls can make $1,500 a week has no bearing with her. He's not lying. $1,500 a week in the early 2000s is real money. That's the defense every operator of every exploitative business has always had ready, and it's not nothing, it's the thinnest true thing you can say about it. What he never addresses, because he can't, is the power behind the number. He's the guy who decides the terms. He's the guy lending money. He's the guy who shows up at your boyfriend's house when you miss work. He's not a neutral observer telling you what the dancers earn. He's the house. And the important part is that even in Silvio's version of the argument, Heather has found the weak point immediately. He tells the story like it's a phase she's going through, but he never actually answers her. There's a scene from way back in the first season that I think is the key to the entire character, and it doesn't come up enough when people talk about Silvio. Meadow and Heather play on the same soccer team. Their coach, Don Hauser, turns out to have been having sex with one of the teenage girls on that team. When the crew finds out, Silvio wants him dead. Tony initially does too. The restraint comes later. Artie tries to stop Tony from turning it into a murder. Melfi pushes him on the same instinct from another direction. Eventually, Tony calls Silvio and cancels the hit, and Hauser is left for the police. But Silvio's first reaction matters. Silvio Dante, who runs the Bing, is ready to kill a grown man for exploiting a teenage girl. I don't think that's hypocrisy in the ordinary sense. Hypocrisy implies he's faking one of the two positions, and he isn't. Both are completely sincere. The girls on that soccer team belong to his daughter's world. He knows them through Heather. They are children being exploited by an adult inside a circle Sil experiences as his own. Tracee exists in another category, and Tracee isn't literally alone. She has a mother, she has a young son. Silvio himself mentions both of them, but those relationships don't generate status inside the organization. There isn't a father, husband, boyfriend, or maid relative standing inside Tony's world whose connection to Tracee forces the crew to treat what happens to her differently. That's the distinction Silvio later spells out himself. Blood, marriage, Gumar. Those relationships count. Tracee doesn't have one that protects her. So it isn't that Silvio believes one type of exploitation is bad and another is good. His moral ledger is built around relationship and status. The soccer team is inside the circle because his daughter is inside it. Tracee is outside the protected circle even while she works in Silvio's building. That's worse than ordinary hypocrisy. A hypocrite has a conscience he's failing to live up to. Silvio has a spreadsheet and it balances, which is why he's the one they send for Adriana. Long-term parking. Season 5, the one that hollows people out. Chris has made the call, Tony makes the play, and Adriana gets a phone call telling her Christopher has tried to kill himself and Silvio's on his way to bring her to the hospital. And she believes it because why wouldn't she? Silvio has been part of the family world she's lived in for years. He's one of Tony's senior men. He's somebody she knows through Christopher, somebody familiar enough that getting into his car doesn't feel like getting into a stranger's. Watch what he actually does in that car, because it's a masterclass in nothing. He doesn't lecture her, he doesn't gloat, he doesn't perform regret, he doesn't do a Pacino. He drives, he makes small talk. He takes an exit she doesn't recognize and keeps driving. Andrea Di Matteo does one of the greatest pieces of acting in the series with her face, as the geography stops making sense. Then he pulls into the trees and drags her out and calls her the worst word available and follows her with a gun as she crawls away, and the camera goes up into the treetops and we hear it instead of seeing it. Chase spares us. He does not spare her. Afterward, Christopher packs her things into a suitcase, dumps it in the Newark marshland, and leaves her Thunderbird at long-term parking at the airport, where it can sit without immediately attracting attention. The title of the episode is a piece of logistics. Here's what I keep coming back to. Silvio doesn't kill Adriana because he's the cruelest guy in the crew. Paulie is crueler, Ralph is crueler, Tony has more personal rage in him than Sil has ever displayed. He kills her because he's the most reliable. He's the one who won't have a crisis about it in the car, won't say something stupid to Christopher. At the funeral there'll never be, won't get drunk in 8 months and confess it to a Gumar. The show has been building that quality into him for years. Jimmy Altieri, Suspected Rat Season 1, Pussy on the Boat Season 2 with Tony and Paulie, Adriana in the Woods Season 5. When the family needs someone erased, Silvio handles it, and handles is exactly the right verb. It's the same verb for what he does with Tracee's shifts. He is, functionally, middle management. He administers people who are being used up. Some of them are women on a stage, and some of them are men in the ground, and the skill set is identical. Keep the schedule, absorb the complaints, don't get emotional, replace what breaks. Which is precisely why he falls apart the second they promote him. Season 6, Mayhem. Tony is in a coma with a hole in his gut and Silvio is acting boss. And the show is very funny about this for about 20 minutes. Sil in a black and gold silk robe eating cereal, Benny picking him up like a chauffeur, the guy visibly enjoying the trappings. He tells Gabriella that Jackie Aprile once considered him as a possible successor and that he ultimately knows he's more comfortable behind the scenes, giving advice and strategy rather than sitting in the chair. Then the actual job arrives. Bobby and Vito want a ruling on collection routes. Paulie and Vito want a ruling on splitting a score and how much of Tony's end goes to Carmela. Every ruling makes somebody unhappy, and there's no version where everybody's happy, and there's nobody above him to blame it on. Guys call his house at night. Guys hound him in his own bathroom. Bobby is complaining at him while he's being loaded into an ambulance, which is one of the best jokes in the back half of the series because his asthma closes his throat. He can't breathe. Within days of being the man who has to make the final decision, his respiratory system gives up on him. Read that however you want, and I think most of the readings are true at once. The cheap version is that it's a plot convenience, so nobody has to succeed Tony. The character version is that Silvio's whole equilibrium depends on someone else carrying final responsibility, and the moment the buck stops with him, the machine fails. My read leans further. It's a body's honest verdict on a life. This is a man who has spent 30 years handling human beings as units, and he can do it flawlessly as long as he's executing someone else's decision. Ask him to decide whose life gets worse, not to enforce it, to author it, and something in him strangles. Tony can do it. That's the terrible thing about Tony, and it's why Tony is the boss and Silvio isn't. Tony authors. Tony decides Adriana dies, and then goes home and continues negotiating the normal business of his marriage and his life. Silvio can administer almost anything Tony asks of him. What nearly breaks him is having to become Tony, and he knows it. Choosing number 2 isn't only modesty, it's self-preservation. He picked the job where most of the time he never has to be the one who said it. Taking a step back, I think this is where the glorified pimp line becomes genuinely useful rather than just a good burn. A pimp, in the ugliest technical sense, is a middleman. He stands between a person and the use of that person and takes a percentage for keeping order. That is Silvio's function in the Bada Bing, and it's also remarkably close to his function in the DiMeo crime family. He stands between Tony and the men. He carries messages. He settles friction. He keeps order. Consigliere is the same basic instinct, with a much nicer word on the door, so the title isn't an insult that reduces him. It's a description that expands outward until it covers the whole organization, which is what the best insults about this show tend to do. His end is worth sitting with. The Blue Comet, second to last hour ever. It opens with Silvio at Bert Gavazzi's house. Bert has been talking to New York, feeling out who'd flip if Phil moves, and he's made the mistake of assuming Sil is a realist about which way the wind blows. Silvio comes in, mentions he's heard about Bert's misgivings, and garrots him in his own living room. No speech, no preamble, no scene beforehand where Bert makes his pitch. The murder opens the episode cold, and we work out the reason afterward from a bandage on Sil's hand. Later, Tony notices the bandage and asks. Silvio's answer, measures were taken. Then he explains that Bert wasn't speaking only for himself, that the guys are getting squeezed hard. Tony asks whether they thought he'd be part of it. And Silvio says, and he got an answer. That's the closest thing to a summary of his life anyone gives him, and it's 4 words in a diner. He was offered the smart play, jump to the winning side, live, and the offer doesn't appear to register as much of a temptation. Not out of love for Tony, or not only, it's structural. Loyalty is one of the few virtues Silvio possesses in abundance, and the show is very careful to demonstrate that absolute loyalty, unattached to any judgment about what you're loyal to, can become something ugly very quickly. It's how Adriana ended up in the woods. It's how Bert ended up on his own carpet. Silvio would probably have done the same job for a worse boss, which means it was never only about Tony being worth it. Then Phil moves, and Silvio walks out of the Bing with Patsy, and Ray and PTB open up on them in the parking lot. Patsy gets out and runs, returning fire. Silvio takes multiple rounds, and look at where it happens, outside his own strip club. The same exterior world where Tracee was beaten to death is now where Silvio himself goes down. The Bing has been the backdrop to ordinary business, jokes, meetings, sex, threats, and violence for years. Now the man who spent his life running the place becomes another body in its parking lot. I don't believe that parallel is accidental. They don't kill him. That's the choice, and it's crueler. He goes into a medically induced coma. By the finale, the doctors don't expect him to regain consciousness. Tony goes to the hospital, Gabriella is sitting there by the bed, and Tony puts his hand on Silvio's for a few seconds without saying a word. Then he leaves. That's it. That's Silvio's exit. He's not on screen again. So the last time we see Silvio Dante, he's a body in a room, kept moving by a machine, while the men who are still conscious conduct their business elsewhere and glance over occasionally. Out of focus, in the background, no lines. He spent his professional life arranging versions of that composition, and he ends up inside one. And the show does not point at this, or score it, or give him a monologue. It just lets it be the composition. I'd argue he never earns a traditional death scene, and that's deliberate. Deaths on this show are events. Ralph in the kitchen, Chris on the roadside, Adriana in the trees. Silvio just stops being available. The family gets an update on his status, and life keeps moving. One more thing about University, because it's the ending that answers everything else. After Tracee is dead, after Tony's rage, after the sheet over the body, after Ralph gets thrown out, the episode gives you a coda in the club. The other dancers briefly gossip about Tracee being gone, and Georgie is already explaining the VIP room to another dancer. Friday nights, high rollers, big tips, the arrangements that come with getting access to that room. That's the last word. Not grief, not consequence, orientation. Tracee has disappeared, and the machinery around the job is already being explained to the next woman. Silvio doesn't even need to be in the shot. The system handles it without him, which is what a functioning business looks like. And that, finally, is my answer to the title. Silvio Dante is not a glorified pimp, because nothing about him was ever glorified except the part he made up. The Pacino line, the Sun Tzu, the pinky ring, the pompadour, the singing career that never happened, that's the varnish, and it's applied with total conviction because Silvio believes in it totally. Underneath is a man who loaned a 20-year-old money for her teeth and collected on it in a driveway and shot his colleague's fiancée in the woods because somebody had to and he was the reliable one, and who could barely breathe when the one job he had successfully avoided finally became his, being the person who makes the decision instead of carrying it out. He was never a gangster with a strip club on the side. He was a strip club with a gangster on the side, and the building, if you're wondering, is still standing on Route 17. The real club used for the Bada Bing was called Satin Dolls then. It's Satin Dolls now, still open.